Hi folks, we're going to continue now in chapter 14, one more chapter of the neurological system. Remember, we only have 14, 15, and 16 left in this term. Hopefully you've already found the list of important structure or important figures and tables that I want you to point out. Now, I'm going to say right up front here that this is going to be a rather short and sketchy kind of lecture, even though we're talking about the brain. There is no way in the world for us to be able to get into any kind of depth of the brain and all its function. All you can expect to do, remember, all that you can expect to do at this point is just to touch on the highlights of the brain tissue and the different areas of the brain and what they do. Only if you're going on into a medical school, nursing school, PA training, or something like that, will you ever be expected to learn more. So let's start into chapter 14. I hope that you have printed out the figures and tables, and also the study guide that you found on page 554. The first section, 14.1, is just a general overview of the brain. And figure 14.1 on the adjoining page shows drawings, the view from the top and view from the side of the brain. And then here is a sectioned brain from a cadaver in the C lateral view. Major landmarks. I want you to have heard these terms, and you can see that in the lateral view B. The terms rostral and caudal. Rostral means toward the nose, and caudal means toward the tail. These are good descriptions for something like a lab animal that has a nose and a tail, but commonly they are used in some anatomy books also, as in this textbook. Now, the brain has three major portions: the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. The cerebrum are all the bulk of the brain that you can see in all of these views. It makes up about 83% of the brain's volume and consists of a pair of cerebral hemispheres. Each of these hemispheres is marked by very thick folds called gyri. The singular for that is gyrus, and separated by shallow grooves called sulci, singular being sulcus. There is also a very prominent longitudinal fissure that separates the right from the left hemispheres. At the bottom of this fissure is a very thick bundle of nerve fibers called the corpus callosum that you can see more in figure 14.2. Now, the cerebellum is the very posterior cranial fossa that is inferior to the cerebrum and separated from it by the transverse cerebral fissure. The brainstem is defined differently, as your author says, by different authorities, but he uses what he calls the original definition. And he says that the brainstem is all of the brain except the cerebrum and the cerebellum. So as you trace down, you will see the various parts of the brainstem, that being the diencephalon, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Now, if you saw a brain before it has been stained or soaked in formalin, you would be able to see very prominent gray and white matter. Just like in the brain stem, the white matter has lots and lots of glia. That's not the right word. Stop, 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 stop. Sorry, I think I just had a little stroke. I went blank again. Not glia, but myelin, as when we talked about nerves. The myelin gives the part of the brain whitish appearance, and the gray matter does not have very much myelin whatsoever. I want you to read a little bit on your own about the development of the brain during the embryonic phase. And there you will see terms such as the forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. And these develop into other areas of the brain as the brain matures. You might see one test question on that later. I have no idea. But don't go into too much detail, as I've told you before. Now, section 14.2 starts on page 512 and talks about meninges, ventricles, cerebral fluid, and blood supply. The best place to see the 3 layers of the meninges is in figure 14.5 on page 514. There you will see a portion of the brain. You see the skull on the outside. Just under the skull is the dura mater, made up of the periosteal layer and the meningeal layer. Then inside of that is the arachnoid mater, and then finally the pia mater. Now, between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater, you will see all of the blood vessels. The sinuses that contain all of the cerebral spinal fluid are between the arachnoid mater and the dura mater. I want you to read more about that also. If you look at figure 14.6, you will see, oh, now I have a dog whining. Hey, stop, stop, stop. Sorry about that, folks. The ventricles help protect the inside of the brain and store cerebral spinal fluid. The lateral view and anterior view in figure 14.6 show where they're located. And in the cadaver brain that has been sectioned longitudinally, you will see both parts of the lateral ventricle and both parts of the lateral ventricle. Sorry about that. Now, look also at figure 14.7, and there you will see a figure showing the flow of the cerebral spinal fluid. It does not just sit in there. It circulates around the brain and has 3 major purposes. The buoyancy, it keeps the brain and other parts of the spinal cord actually floating in the cerebral spinal fluid. We don't want it to be hard against any bone tissue. It also protects the brain from striking the cranium, the skull, if the head is suddenly jolted. It also helps maintain chemical stability in removing metabolic wastes and supplying chemical ions and other particles, molecules to the brain. The blood supply is twofold. We'll study that a little bit later, but the 2 carotid arteries, right and left carotid artery, supply the bulk of the brain tissue, and the two vertebral arteries in the posterior part of the spine supply the posterior portion of the brain, especially around the cerebellum. I want to just mention one thing here, the blood-brain barrier. This is something that is very unique to the central nervous system. This is a protective layer that keeps things away from the central nervous system cells that our maker did not want to touch these cells. Remember that. Read a little bit more about it. The blood-brain barrier. Now I'm going to talk about part of the brain stem, but I'm not going to talk in very much detail. I want you to go through these, starting in section 14.3, at the bottom of 517 with the medulla oblongata. Be able to show it where it is on a picture and memorize one or two things that are found in each of these areas of the brain stem. Just inferior to the medulla oblongata is the pons and the cerebellum. The cerebellum sits just posterior to the pons. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Finally, the midbrain. And then superior is the diencephalon. Something that is also very important, you will see and read about on page 521, the reticular formation. Your author calls this a loose web of gray matter that runs vertically through all levels of the brainstem. And it has many, many different networks and functions, such as somatic motor control, cardiovascular control, pain modulation, habituation, and sleep and consciousness. Try to remember that list. Now we'll talk briefly about the cerebellum. It is shown in figure 14.11. It is the most inferior and posterior part of the brain. There's been a lot of discussion and argument over the years about what the actual functions are of the cerebellum. But your author states, and that's what we'll go with right now, quote, "It appears that the general role of the cerebellum is the evaluation of certain kinds of sensory input and then monitoring muscle movement." When I learned this way back when, we learned that the cerebellum is a primary organ in charge or that functions in keeping our balance, particularly if we are standing upright. But as time goes on, more and more and more is learned, of course. Section 14.4 shows discussion of the forebrain. And the forebrain consists of the diencephalon and the telecephalon. These are shown in figures 14.12. Sorry, that only shows the diencephalon. The most important organs here that I want you to learn about are the thalamus, that's in 1412, little picture A, and then the hypothalamus that is in smaller picture B. These are part of the central nervous system, but in fact, the hypothalamus, you will find in next semester, is actually also part of the endocrine system. So read about those, and again, be able to point them out on a sketch, and know just a few things that they do. One of the most important things that the hypothalamus does is hormone secretion. It's a major integrating system of our autonomic nervous system that we will talk about in chapter 15. There's a hypothalamic thermostat that controls our inner body temperature. It also controls food and water intake, sleep and circadian rhythms, and memory. It is a very, very important structure for one so small. Now let's look at the cerebrum. The cerebrum, as I mentioned, has the right and the left hemispheres. And these are grossly mirror images of each other, but they have different functions in the different parts. Figure 14.13 shows in color the different lobes of the cerebrum. Once again, I want you to memorize where these lobes are and be able to identify them on a test question. Starting from the most anterior going to the posterior is the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, and then the occipital lobe across the top. And on the sides are the two temporal lobes. Also very important, if you look at 14.13, you will see the pre-central gyrus and the post-central gyrus. And we will come back to that in just a moment and show you the very important functions that those two gyri have. Now, I do not want you even attempting to learn about all of the different tracts that go through the brain. When I studied neuroanatomy in my first year of medical school, honest to goodness, I almost quit because I had a wonderful career going in the military and had resigned my commission as an 04 in the Air Force to go back to medical school. And suddenly I thought, oh my Lord, what have I done? That was the first thing we had to study, was neuroanatomy. And I barely passed somehow. Section 14.5 talks about some of the integrative functions of the brain, such as sleep, cognition, memory, emotion, sensation. Also, it has some of the areas for the special senses. Now, as I said, I want to talk to you about the pre-central gyrus and the post-central gyrus. Look now at figure 14.21 on page 537. The small figure A to the left shows both the pre-central gyrus in gray, the central sulcus between them, and the post central gyrus in more of a violet color. And here is what I want you to know about these. The precentral gyrus, located in the anterior lobe, is the area that is primarily responsible for all of our voluntary motor movements, okay? All of our voluntary muscles are controlled by cells in the precentral gyrus. Now, in the postcentral gyrus, there are numerous neurons that are whose primary responsibility is receiving all of the sensory input from the entire body. For example, if you have somebody steps on your little toe, and that's quite a distance from your brain, a nerve impulse telling your body that you're having pain and originates in the little toe. It transmits all the way through a long nerve to the spinal cord, up through the brain stem, and finally ends up at a very small section of the postcentral gyrus. And that is how our brain knows that we have pain in a little toe. Look carefully, if you will, at figure B or part B in figure 14.21. There you will see a very famous picture showing the different areas of this postcentral gyrus and the sensation that they are responsible for. And on the very internal part, in the longitudinal gyrus, you will see a very small area labeled toes. So that is the area, the neurons there receive these impulses all the way from the toes. Okay. Again, I apologize. I could talk for 1 or 2 hours, or probably I'd have to read this because it's been a long time. I want you now, we're going to finish up discussing the cranial nerves. And this is section 14.6. We talked about the spinal nerves. There were 31 pairs of spinal nerves that came off of the spinal cord. These were responsible for movement and control and sensation of the vast majority of the body. Now, there are also 12 pairs of cranial nerves. The cell bodies for these nerves are in various portions of the brain and the central nervous system inside the skull. And these travel very circuitously around and around and finally exit the skull through various foramini to supply various parts of our face, our neck, our eyes, ears, etc. Table 14.1, that goes on for 3 pages, talks about each of these nerves one at a time. By tradition, they are numbered 1 through 12 using Roman numerals. And that's why you will see, if you go through there, Roman numerals. And I stopped too prematurely, didn't I? 546, 547, 548, 549, 550, and 551 all show cranial nerves. You do not have to memorize all of these, but it would be a good idea to know a little bit about each nerve and what it does. When I was in medical school, I'm just going to carry on here for just a minute more. There was a mnemonic that I learned in order to remember the names of the 12 cranial nerves. The mnemonic went like this: on old Olympus, towering tops, a Finn and German viewed some hops. Now, that doesn't make sense, but I will tell you now that I started medical school in 1974. That was over 40 years ago, and I still remember that. However, some of the names of these nerves have been changed for some reason, and here are a couple more mnemonics that are listed on page 545. Oh, once one takes the anatomy final, very good vacation ahead. Now, the first two letters of ahead represent nerves 11 and 12. There's a third one that I have never heard either, and this the author claims one of his students devised, and it has in it either the first two up to the first 4 letters of each of the nerves. Old Opie occasionally tries trigonometry and feels very gloomy, vague, and hypoactive. It might be a good idea. You might get one question more right without guessing on the test if you memorize one of the 2 mnemonics there and know what the names of the nerves are. Now, with that, I will close at 33 minutes. I apologize that I have to look away and look into the textbook so much, but I am not an anatomist. I did not get a PhD in anatomy. I'm only an old retired family doctor who had to use a lot of this material. But as I said, I learned it back in the 1970s, and I can't lecture on it from memory anymore. Okay, thank you for listening.